Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 12, 2021. Let me begin with the announcement from the Chinese that confirmed there will be a meeting between two top Chinese foreign policy officials with American officials, Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan, that will take place on March 18th in Anchorage, Alaska. While both sides are saying that they're cautiously optimistic, there's an effort from the U.S. side to lower expectations, with Blinken saying this is not a strategic dialogue and there's no guarantee there'll be a continuing follow-on to this meeting. However, it's important that the discussion take place instead of the threats that have been going back and forth across the Pacific, especially from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and now from U.S. military officials, most recently the head of the Indo-Pacific Command, Davidson, who essentially called for a massive military buildup by the United States in the Asian Pacific region to counter Chinese aggression. These are the two largest economic powers on the earth. And at a time of a continuing COVID crisis, a faltering and collapsing strategic situation and economic situation, it's necessary that there be discussion. Hopefully it will develop into a full dialogue of nations committed to both each other's sovereign rights and at the same time a defense of the interests of the people of the two countries. So I see this as a positive first step, but we'll see where it goes from here. Now, the first question was someone wrote and said, well, what is Biden's policy on China? They referred in the question to the fact that Biden, in his talk at the Munich Security Conference in February, said that he does not want a new Cold War and that each side does have a right to its sovereign interests. And in this, he was reflecting what President Trump said in his September 2019 address to the UN General Assembly, where he said, for the United States to assert its sovereignty does not mean that other nations don't have sovereign rights also, and that we support those sovereign rights. Apparently, in Biden's Munich address, he was referring to a similar conception of mutual sovereignty. Now, the question is, how far does this go in his administration? Because Secretary of State Blinken has been very direct in threatening to counter what he calls China's malign influence. And as I said earlier, there's a whole series of military officials who are making references to build up in the Pacific. There's even a talk of extending NATO into the Indo-Pacific. So what is Biden's policy? Well, we'll see. It would be foolish to engage in the spending regime that's necessary for a massive buildup in the Indo-Pacific. It's also a delusion to think that somehow we could win a war with China. A war at this time between such powerful countries will have no winner. All of humanity will be the loser. So dialogue and discussion are better. Hopefully that's the course that the Biden administration will take. And we as American citizens have to make our voices heard on this. If we're tired of the endless wars, why would we be supporting policies that will provoke new wars, this time with Russia and China? Now, a question related to this, someone asked, why does NATO still exist? And they point out that the original purpose of NATO was to protect Western Europe from the Warsaw Pact military alliance of the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1990. There's no longer a Warsaw Pact. So why is NATO moving eastward to the border of Russia? And why is there now talk about a NATO extension into the Indo-Pacific region? This is British geopolitics, plain and simple. The idea behind geopolitics is that an alliance of European nations with Eurasian powers would end the supremacy of British naval power and British foreign policy influence and control. This was Mackinder's doctrine that was put forward in a 1904 speech, repeated in a 1919 paper, and then again in 1924, where he said that there are interests for the British and its allies in the Pacific. Now, what are those interests? Is sending a German frigate or one or two British aircraft carriers into the region somehow going to defend Western Europe and defend the European nations? What is NATO's stake in this? The reality is that the European Union is a collapsing, failed system, and it's not going to be improved by sending troops all over the world. There are still NATO troops in Afghanistan and I believe Iraq. What's the purpose of this? This kind of extended war-like deployment puts nations against each other, which is, of course, the whole purpose of geopolitics. What Mackinder argued is there must never be an alliance that's allowed to come into existence between Western European powers and Eurasian powers. So the idea of a NATO extension, which in some terms is called the Quad referring to Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the United States, that this would be an Asian NATO. This goes back to Bush and Cheney. And the successor to PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, called the Center for New American Security, in 2008 argued that the United States must be involved in new military alliances in Asia to counter China. This was picked up by Obama, who made this a major part of his policy in what was called the Asia Pivot. And the Asia Pivot, using language of Mackinder, because Mackinder talked about pivot points, the Asia Pivot was a military and economic assertion of U.S. power into Asia, which was typified by the air-sea battle concept from 2010, and then the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Hillary Clinton hailed as the gold standard of free trade agreements. Well, these were policies that excluded China and that, in fact, were marching toward a war with China. So the real issue here of NATO extension is, will we have a new Cold War that could become a hot war or not? Hopefully, this will not be the direction. That's why we're going to have a conference on March 20th and 21st, an online conference, to discuss this strategic question. What are the legitimate U.S. interests that should be adopted by a new Biden administration? Now, finally, we have a question from someone about the idea of a COVID vaccine passport. There's talk that in order to travel in the future, you'll need to have some kind of passport which shows that you've been inoculated against the coronavirus. And the person asks, is this merely a new mass surveillance tactic? My answer is fairly simple. You don't need a COVID passport for expanding mass surveillance. We've been living under a surveillance state, especially since the events of September 11th, 2001. Sorry, I have a slight cold. As Edward Snowden pointed out, this has been the threat that's been developing and has been increasing. And people who talk about China's social credit system and China's mass surveillance, you have the same thing in the West. You have control through the National Security Agency, through GCHQ, through various European security forces that keep tabs on everything. There's mass metadata collection that goes on in the United States. Every time you log on to a computer, every time you make a call on your mobile phone, you're worried about mass surveillance. Well, your GPS system is monitored so that anyone who wanted to could find out where you're going at any point in time, what you're buying, what movies you're watching, who you're talking to. So the idea that you would be increasing the mass surveillance with a COVID passport is really, I think, an attempt to scare people into thinking that we have to opt out of the system entirely. The issue here is not the question of a coronavirus passport. It's, are we going to take steps to end the security state and the surveillance state? Now, President Trump could have done us a great service had he pardoned Snowden and pardoned Julian Assange so that we could have gotten into the open just how complete this surveillance state is in the United States and Western Europe. Unfortunately, he didn't do that. Also, we never had the documents released publicly which show the extent to which big tech and the intelligence community, which is really the new military-industrial complex, how much not just data collection they're doing, but how they're using social media to manipulate the way you think. So rather than being focused on a COVID passport as a new extension using the pandemic as an excuse to surveil you, you have to realize you're already under mass surveillance. And we need a move against the big tech companies as well as against the Patriot Act. And unfortunately, the Biden administration and its supporters in the Congress are going to use the January 6th events with the storming of the Capitol as an excuse to expand the Patriot Act. This is going in the wrong direction, and this has to be ended. So I thank you for your questions and wish you a good weekend, and I'll see you again on Monday.